Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Have You Know Game. I'm John Hunter. Recently, I learned about a game in development called Code Atlas. I'm really excited to tell you about this game. If you're a fan of Axis and Allies style games like I am, I think you're really going to like Code Atlas because it's very much like those games, but it offers so much more in gameplay. Now, let's get into Code Atlas. Shortly after learning about this game, I joined the developers' Discord channel. While I was in the Code Atlas Discord channel, I contacted the developers directly, and they were gracious enough to give me about an hour or so of their time, giving me a tour of the game using Tabletop Simulator. In the end, I had a good understanding of how the game was played, and I have to say, I became even more excited about the game than I was when I originally started my venture into looking into it. I want to give you a quick summary of the game. So I'm going to read it straight from the rulebook to be precise using their words. Quote, Code Atlas is a game of politics, trade, intrigue, and war. In this game, 5 players will champion the world powers of China, the Commonwealth, European Union, Russia, and the United States. The goal of the game is to be the first player to reach 10 victory points. To achieve their goals, each player will need to form alliances with opponents and defeat forces from enemy nations. End quote. So players are going to use diplomacy, resource management, unit management, and military strategy to reach a total of 10 victory points to win the game. The game is currently designed for 5 players. This may change down the road, but as of right now, it's currently balanced for exactly 5 people to play. Code Atlas has been in development for 3 years, so it's fully fleshed out and is definitely a playable game at this point, even though there may still be some more tweaks that need to be made to the game. As mentioned earlier, the playable countries are America, Russia, China, Europe, and Colonial. The Colonial being the United Kingdom, basically. Each of them have their own designated home territories. The game also uses non-player factions such as neutrals and rebels, which can be used by all players to help control territories. Each of these factions start the same at the beginning of the game, but become asymmetrical through the acquisition of technology and government cards during the game. Let's get into the board game layout. The main board is a map of the world. Developers have indicated that they plan to make the size of this game board 1 by 2 meters, which is approximately 3 feet by 6 feet. That to me is really big. So I love a big board, especially with a game like this, because you have lots of room for placing units and resources. But 3 by 6 is probably going to be a big board area for some people who maybe don't have large gaming tables. So we'll see what that actually comes out to in the end once it gets developed. The board itself is broken into many different land and sea territories. Each of these may provide resources to players that they can then use to strengthen their country. Next, after the main board, you have the national focus boards. These are used for holding technology cards, resources, and purchased units. Next is what I refer to as the auxiliary board. It's used for tracking turn order, turn phases, and non-aggression packs. This may actually be integrated into the main map board and not a separate board, but since it has a completely different area that it's got information, it seems like a separate board to me. Lastly, we have the combat board. It's used to organize your military units during battles. So each of your military units that you're bringing into battle will go into one of these several zones on the board based on the unit type, and the board will indicate which number you need to get on your dice roll in order to score a hit. So it helps to keep your combat organized. Players will need to use military units, particularly infantry, along with placement of embassies to gain control of territories on the map. Each territory has a GDP value and may also contain resources. Now, I did mention particularly infantry when it comes to controlling territories because they're the only land unit that will actually allow you to control a territory. So even though you can go into combat with tanks or armored fighting vehicles, if you want to have control of that vehicle or the control of that territory once the combat is over, you need to have infantry who survive the battle. GDP and resources are used to purchase units and to bargain with other players during negotiations throughout the game. Okay, let's talk about the different phases that will happen each round of the game. First off, players will bid for turn order each round of the game using their GDP resources. Phase 1 is government selection. In this round, players will have the option to pick from one of 10 government types, and each of these government types will affect gameplay differently. Each round, you can pick a new government type, so you're not stuck with one government type the entire game. The next phase, number 2, is activate cards. Here, players will select and activate technology cards that give unit upgrades and special gameplay abilities. There's 3 types of tech: immediate, charge, and permanent. Immediate tech is something where the benefit will be received right away. Charge tech is something where there'll be a number of counters so that that technology can be used for a limited number of times. And then permanent technology is a benefit that once you obtain the technology, you will have it for the rest of the game, or until you discard your technology card. There is a limit of 5 active techs per player. So once you have 5 technologies, you can still add new technologies, but you will have to discard one of your 5 to make room for the new one. Phase 3 is the influence phase, where players will place their embassies. Embassies are used to control territories just like military units would. So instead of having to build this massive army to control all these territories, you also have embassies at your disposal to help you control the various territories around the globe. Phase 4 is the buy phase. This is where players will purchase their units. The units cost GDP and resources. Now, there are 4 resources in the game: oil, minerals, food, and energy. The units in the game that can be purchased are infantry, armored fighting vehicles, tanks, strategic bombers, stealth bombers, jets, carriers, cruisers, submarines, cruise missiles, nukes, anti-air guns, military bases, satellites, commanders, and aircraft carriers. Phase 5 is movement. Movement is broken into 3 sections. First is land, then sea, then air. So to explain this a little further, what that means is in the turn order that the players bid for, they will first move their land units. Once every player has moved all their land units for that round, then they move to sea movement. And then again, in turn order, they move their sea units. And then finally, they'll move their air units. The beauty of this, and one of the things I really like about this game, is that they break up the movement by unit type. Because since each turn you're bidding for turn order, this gives an opportunity for a player who maybe is number 1 in the turn order and move their land units, only to find that a subsequent player made movement of land units that put them at a disadvantage. That player in position number 1 still has an opportunity to maybe protect themselves by moving sea or air units subsequently to help them out. Phase 6 is negotiation. This is a phase where players can attempt to avoid military conflict with other players. The players may exchange GDP, resources, units, and/or infrastructure from the player's build queue. Now, if negotiation fails and the players aren't able to come to an agreement to avoid the conflict, then you move to the second part of the negotiation phase, which is then firing missiles. At this point, players can fire any cruise missiles or nuclear missiles that they have in their arsenal. Phase 7 is combat. Combat is also broken down into a couple subsections. First, you have pre-combat 1, which is basically an attack pre-combat. This is conducted by subs and cruisers. The second section is pre-combat 2. This is basically a defensive pre-combat. At this point, players will be able to fire their anti-aircraft guns from military bases, cruisers, aircraft carriers, or actual anti-aircraft guns themselves. And then finally, you have the actual conflict where the battle occurs. Now, a couple special units that I haven't mentioned yet are the commanders and satellites. Commanders are valuable because they increase your naval movement, and also they allow reroll of misses for one round of combat. Satellites allow a full reroll of single combat round. Satellites allow for a full reroll of a single combat round. Now, to clarify the difference between these two, so commanders are slightly better because if, let's say in combat, you're rolling 5 combat dice and you only land 2 hits, commanders will allow you to re-roll the 3 dice that missed and maybe increase the number of hits you get. Whereas satellites, because you're re-rolling all of the dice, actually have the potential, if you score 2 hits and you elect to use your satellite to do a full re-roll, you could potentially lose those 2 hits. So it's a lot more random if you use your satellites. Phase 8 is the place units phase. This is where players will be able to distribute the units that they purchased in the buy phase around the map and the territories that they control. Phase 9 is the collect phase. This is where players will collect any GDP and resources that they can from their territories. Players will have the ability to place harbors along coastlines to create supply lines for resources, and then they can place oil rigs in sea zones where there are resources to be able to collect those resources. Now, the important thing is that your resources must have a territorial line of connection back to your capital in order to be able to collect those resources. So you're going to have to strategically plan which territories you control and make sure that you have that direct link so you don't miss out on gathering resources that you're going to really need. Phase 10 involves adjusting the Defcon level down by 1. So in this game, you will have 5 levels of Defcon. The game starts, everyone's at Defcon level 5. And each subsequent round, the Defcon level will move up by 1 until you get to Defcon level 1. This is used to signify the increasing tension in the world as players continue to play and vie for territories. Now, the interesting thing is that although each player will move up 1 Defcon level as the rounds proceed, there's also the possibility that a player jumps ahead and moves all the way down to Defcon 1 depending on certain conditions. And so those conditions are, if a player makes 8 or more attacks in 1 round, then they will immediately jump to Defcon 1. Additionally, if they use a nuclear weapon, they will jump to Defcon 1. And finally, if they attack and capture an enemy capital, they go to Defcon 1. And then as sort of a side possibility for going to Defcon 1 immediately, one of the tech cards that are in the game can be used by a player to send another player down to Defcon 1. Why is this important? The Defcon 1 phase? Because once a player is at Defcon 1 level, their home cities and can now be targeted by a nuclear attack from other players. So, in other words, as long as you're at Defcon level 5 through 2, other players will not be able to nuke your home territories. So you have to play the game carefully to make sure that you do not prematurely go to Defcon 1 unless you've really taken that into consideration in your strategy. Okay, let's move on to phase 11. That's the bidding phase. So players will again be able to bid for a new turn order that will take place in the subsequent round. And then finally, phase 12 is cleanup of the board. Now, I talked about the game with the developers, and one of my first questions was, how long does this game actually take to play? And they say it's actually a long game. It's probably going to take several hours to actually play the game. It should be noted that games usually end prior to or just after reaching Defcon level 1. So you may be looking at some of these pictures of the game board and thinking, wow, this seems like there's a lot going on. But honestly, as I talked to the developers and they ran through how the game is played, it actually does not seem very complex at all. I would probably rate it maybe a medium complexity. But what's great about it is there's so many levels to this game that it really makes the gameplay deep and gives a lot of options for players on how they're going to move forward to get those 10 victory points. What I like so much about this game is that it's so much more than just a straightforward military territorial combat game. Players will need to rely heavily on negotiation and non-combat strategy for control of the world's vital resources. This built-in player interaction means that each game will be different just based on negotiations alone, not even taking into account some of the other elements of the gameplay that I've already discussed. I have to say I'm really excited to see this game come into production. It really has the potential to be one of my favorite board games if it is produced in a manner that's similar to what I'm seeing right now. There are really only two negatives that I see with the game in its current state, and I really don't see them as major issues. But the first is the 5-player requirement. The 5-player requirement, that's something that may get resolved down the road as the developers continue to work on balancing issues. I know that they recognize that it would be better for a game to have a little bit of flexibility as far as player count, maybe something like a 3 to 5 player game, but we'll see if they're able to make that happen. And then the second issue is the long playtime for this game. The developers indicated that they expect this game will take several hours to play, maybe even longer. The issue at hand really revolves around the negotiating aspect in this game. So if your play group is such that they're going to spend a lot of time doing negotiations, that's going to prolong this game. But from what I see, the actual play of the game, placing units, drawing cards, that seems to go pretty quick. So I think the length of play time for this game a lot of it will be in the player's hands to some extent. They can control how long people can enter negotiations, maybe set a time limit. So that may be resolved that way. Also, I suspect that on some level, as the developers continue to work on this game, they may look to streamline that a little bit so that people that are maybe not interested in playing games for several hours, if we can get it down a little bit, we can maybe bring them on board too. And the other idea that I have, I don't know if the developers are interested in this, but one of the things when I was a teenager and used to play Axis and Allies, and my friends would have these longer games that we couldn't finish in time, we actually developed a system where we used a chart that listed all of the territories on the map, and that was cross-sectioned with all of the different military units or pieces that get placed on the board, so you can quickly not mark off where everything is at the point where you're like, you need to take a break in the play of this game. And then when you come back at a later date, you just pull that chart out and just quickly set everything up just like you would the start of any other game and resume where you were. And I don't see that there's any issue with continuity in playing this game from one date to the next. So regardless of these issues, which again, I don't see as anything major, I still think that this game has great potential to be a fantastic, fun game. I'm really looking forward to this coming out in tabletop version, and I suspect that this will probably be one of my favorite games if we can get this out onto a tabletop version. So if this game sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend connecting with the community over at Discord. I've provided the links to their Discord channel down in the description for this video, but I've also included links to their other social media accounts if you want to follow them that way. If you enter their Discord channel, you'll have access to a lot more screenshots than what I've shown you here. You'll also have access to the rule book in its current state, and you may even have a chance to play the game with the developers via Tabletop Simulator. And if you're not familiar with Tabletop Simulator, it's basically a virtual rendition of various games, and you can get this through Steam. So if this is something you're interested in, check out the Discord channel and then maybe go over to Steam and look at Tabletop Simulator and see all the things you can do with that. Not just for Code Atlas, but it's also viable for many other tabletop games. So my point of this video is, the more people we can get into Discord showing support for this game, I think the more likely it is that we will see it develop into an actual tabletop rendition. So I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope you're now as excited about this game as I am. I'm going to be following this project closely, and I'll update you down the road with any new and notable developments. So make sure you click subscribe so you're notified when I put out any new videos about Code Atlas. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate everyone's support of this channel. In my next video, I'm going to be discussing Magic the Gathering and going over the various decks that I'm currently using to play. So make sure you're sticking around and following so that we can discuss that as well. And with that, I'd like to say thanks for watching and have a great day of gaming.